Hello. In episode 28.2 of AS for Architecture, Gordana Fontana-Giusti, Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at Kent School of Architecture and Planning, University of Kent, discusses her 2013 book, Foucault for Architects, published by Routledge in 2013 as part of their Thinkers for Architects series.
Before Foucault, it was not, these kind of categories were not really studied very much. And they were, in a way, dug out, really, from obscurity by Foucault, by producing all these discourses. So in a way, he, by studying the discourse on man, he, by studying the category of knowledge and its conditions and how it changes through time, and by recognizing the limits of language and the need to expand, if you want, into space, three-dimensional space, but also the space of history, he actually brought us as architects to these categories of madness and asylum, prison, and the hospital. So this is kind of very interesting. If you want, this is kind of his contribution to architectural discourse, that he sort of brought these kind of categories from obscurity into kind of mainstream architectural history.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I am here today with Professor Gordana Fontana-Giusti. Professor Gordana, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Ambrose, my dear colleague at the University of Kent. Yes, I have been teaching at the University of Kent since 2007, when I was made a professor of architecture and urban design, urban regeneration. And it's been a very fun time since then. It's been now 16 years. Prior to that, I was at Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design when I was where I was urban designer and researcher on an urban design project called Agora Cities for People. Prior to that, I was at the Architectural Association, where I taught for 10 years, and where I also acquired my doctorate, which was on deconstructing Alberti's De Reedificatoria, De Pictura, and De Commodis anque Incommodis Literarum. So yes, it's quite a varied background, but I suppose some of these ingredients are important for what we are going to talk.
I think so. I like this idea of taking Alberti and deconstructing him. Is that deconstructing in a deconstructivist sense, or is that?
Yeah.
So you're applying deconstructivist logic to a Renaissance architect?
Yeah, that was the subject. In fact, I wanted to do a PhD on deconstruction, and this was in a way 87 when I wanted to do it, 86, 87, when in a way there was no still deconstructivism as movement. And I wanted to do first a thesis, like a postgraduate thesis, and then a PhD on deconstruction by Derrida, primarily philosophy by Derrida, and how that could influence architecture and architecture design in particular. And I was studying at the time already Chumi, Russian constructivist, and Zaha as kind of examples. And as I'm saying, this was quite important. At the time, it was quite novel. It was not a novel to the context of the AA, but nobody has put the thesis, joined them all together with Derrida. But that was considered like too risky and too kind of new, and not enough information was there. And I was discouraged of doing this. And they say, if you're fond of Derrida and deconstruction, do a deconstruction of a canonical text in architecture. I said, which ones? Well, one of the architectural treatises of the Renaissance. So I said, fine. And I chose Alberti's De Reedificatoria. So the rest is history.
Yeah, for sure. Did you publish that?
It was published, various chapters, but as a whole book, it was not published. One chapter was published in Walls and Walling in Architectural Journal. The other on Perspective, central chapter of Perspective was published in AA Files. And yes, perhaps I should publish it. Yes. At the time, we were actually not encouraged to publish it. In a way, we were discouraged. It's a very old system, completely different how we teach now students nowadays. There's
this idea, I think, that I get from that of kind of contesting established norms, and the book that we're going to talk about today, which is your book, Foucault for Architects, in the Routledge Thinkers for Architecture series. And that was published in 2017. 2013, but it's the third that in the series that I've covered on this podcast, the others being Albania Neva's Latour for Architects and Jonathan Hale's Merleau-Ponty for Architects. And it's really wonderful and really beautifully written, very clearly written. But I wondered, so Michel Foucault, massively important late 20th century philosopher and theorist, whose work has been increasingly applied to architecture. And that's what we're going to talk about, and how it applies, and some of those ways. Obviously, we can't cover it all. Your knowledge is too great. We'll fill more than an hour. But maybe we can start off by you sort of describing and explaining who Michel Foucault was, his epoch, and his significance, I suppose.
Yes, of course. He was born in France in 1926. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of an interesting generation. They were kind of living through the Second World War, enough to feel it, being old enough to feel it, but not yet being kind of mature, individuals that were kind of going through it as kind of a mature persons. But I always feel that must made a great significance on their lives, and that in that sense it's quite important. But most of his education happened afterwards, after the Second World War, when he went to study psychology, and he studied in Paris. He was somewhat a problematic kind of a young man, sort of sometimes behaving in funny ways, and he was not kind of the usual chap in the group of people. He was always having his own ideas and wanting to do things differently, sometimes being on his own, sometimes disappearing, etc. But he was an excellent student, and he was definitely an excellent student once he got into his studies of psychology. He studied under Jean Hippolyte. He also was very interested in the work of Binswanger, which was related to his thesis. After graduating, he sort of did all sorts of odd jobs, like teaching in Lille, teaching around France, also teaching abroad. He was he got this kind of semi-diplomatic jobs in French cultural centers in Uppsala. He was in Sweden and in Norway. I think he was also in Warsaw and in Germany, which sort of gave him, I'm mentioning that because it gave him sort of wide kind of exposure to various cultures. At that kind of age, in the 50s, where not many people were traveling. So he was exposed to all these kind of different cultures, even going behind the Iron Curtain during the time of the Cold War, and sort of pursuing what was always his pursuit, and that was, in a way, the pursuit of knowledge. He was interested in knowledge, in savoir. He wanted to know, what is this thing called knowledge? Where does it come from? And how are we to relate to it?
Yeah.
And how we, as human subjects and human beings, in our particular moment of time, in our moment of actuality, actually establish ourselves as subjects, which we do in relation to the knowledge that we acquire. So that was, in a way, something that kind of started to affect him from his early days, and that then you could see how it sort of went through different stages. When he came back to France in the late 50s, he then sort of pursued his doctorate, and his doctorate was famously on madness. And this was also his famous book that came out first, which was Madness and Civilization in English, in French, Histoire de la Folie, the history of madness. So that was a landmark book straight when it emerged, because it was somebody who was dealing with a subject that was not formally dealt with before, and certainly not within the kind of discourse which was theoretical, philosophical, and so on and so forth. It was something that was sort of living at the at the margins of the society and sort of something that belonged to medical discourse and asylum and so on and so forth. But he sort of put it center stage. And in a way, you could say, if we are talking about Foucault's method, that's one of the things he would do. Take something which is on the margin, but which appears to him to be quite important for the human subject, and put it center stage, saying it, well, listen, this is something important. We have to sort of expand on this. What does that mean to be mad? What are the conditions of madness? When did madness appear in the society as such? How far back can we trace it? Was it always considered in the same way we consider it nowadays? And so on and so forth. And these kind of questions, of course, led him to kind of research it in more details and to establish some kind of postulates about madness, which famously grounded it within this kind of new approach that could be traced back to, if you want, 17th century, late 16th and 17th century. And from then onwards, he sort of follows it in detail. So one of his approach and one of his methods, you could say, is this kind of looking at the stuff at the margin, but which are important for human conditions. And on the other, when he posed that question and when he decided to go for it and do it, he really pushed himself to do it in a most systematic way, looking at the archives, pursuing archaeological, if you want, study of the archives in great details, which subsequently he called genealogy. And that is the famous approach that he has, which is this genealogical approach, when you kind of start to kind of investigate something which is relevant for us nowadays, but in order to establish how and where and under which condition this particular phenomena that matters to us now had emerged in the past, you then sort of apply yourself with so much, if you want, interest, dedication, and archaeological precision that becomes this genealogy.
I really like this idea. I think this is a really interesting, because I was listening to you talk about the way that he produces this work is very different from a philosopher, or as we understand it. And it seems to be very different from, a medical perspective. And it seems to be very different from a normal, historiographic method. But it's a kind of piecing together a rich picture of kind of different forms of data to triangulate. And I think that's a really kind of, that must be one of the most significant things about him, this kind of breaking apart of disciplinary boundaries to try and generate, to try and situate, as you said, these margins at the center of cultural discourse.
Exactly. That's absolutely true. But what is also important is to notice that whenever he posed this question, which was always about us, the human subjects, at this particular moment of time, i.e. now, when what he calls actualité, the present moment, our actuality. It sounds a bit different in English, but let's call it like that. But by that he means we should be only going back to history, asking this kind of questions if the question that we want to pose is relevant for us now. And if it's sort of exposing certain fragility, if you want, to the discourse that we had about the human subject before. So he's interested to highlight these kind of margins that are kind of not well established, not well thought, not well understood, not well researched, but which he somehow feels are important and which expose the human fragility and which are linked to something fragile about us. This is why he sort of approached madness. But the point is important that he always starts from the point of view of contemporary condition of the speaking, working, thinking subject. And then he sort of goes back to analyze it. Yeah.
I think this is a really beautiful, this idea, this word fragility you used, and also this French word actualité, or nowness, I suppose, might be the presentness of things. And there's an inherently activist idea about this as well. It seems to me to be by looking at the mad, and he wasn't just looking at the mad from the perspective or the what we would now call people with mental health problems, I suppose, or people with learning difficulties in one way or another. He wasn't just looking at them from the perspective of the psychology, but looking at them in a kind of holistic sense. And in so doing, as I said before, like drawing them in from the margins. But there is this focus in his work about looking at discrepant behaviors and using them as a way of reflecting on the present socio-cultural and political condition. Like, what does it say about the non-mad, how we treat the mad? Am I right in thinking that? Is that what he's trying to do?
Yeah, you can put it that way. It would be exactly the kind of territory and the kind of questioning that he would like to pursue. In that sense, if we want to sort of somehow position him along the lines that you mentioned, and that you have just mentioned, we could say that, he starts his discourse in this kind of late 50s, and we have to sort of historically think where it was. He was in France, in Western Europe, and these questions that he posed were really very much part of what was at the time considered like phenomenology, like the dominant style of analysis and the dominant way of thinking amongst the kind of intellectuals, if I can put it that way. Its style of analysis is therefore something that analyzes concrete reality, and Foucault picks up that from, if you want, phenomenologists. He picks that up from Merleau-Ponty, if you want. He picks that up from Blanchot, he picks that up from Bergson, and all these people who were kind of exploring the questions, not the kind of traditional philosophical questions in the manner of Hegel and Kant, but were exploring, as it were, the actuality, the reality, the concreteness of the issues. So he picks that up from them, but he sort of goes beyond that. He also picks it up in relation to, you were mentioning, the activism. Yes, he was very much inspired by the activism of Marxism and Marxist philosophers in France at the time, to the extent that he was open-minded to these discussions. And what he said, he managed to actually learn a lot about historical analysis from the works of Marx, where he was talking about this kind of dialectical forces and historical and dialectical materialism in history, and how they kind of fight for kind of prestige. So he was kind of that was, if you want, the second source for Foucault. First one being the phenomenology, second being Marxism, and the third one, I should say, which is quite important, and that in a way is evident throughout his work, is that he was interested and in the history of science. Yes, he was really following this kind of very strong tradition that exists in France in history of science, and indeed people like Bachelard, Canguilhem, Cavaille belonged to it, and his supervisor was Canguilhem, who in a way guided him throughout his PhD, a doctorate on madness. So doctorate on madness was also kind of having this kind of context as well. So yes.
So this idea around, so this kind of usefully brings us on this idea about the science aspect of his interest, the philosophy, historio-philosophical character of science, has a relationship to ideas around knowledge, who produces it, how it's produced, what it is. And he has a kind of, Foucault has a kind of, his thesis is based around the centrality of language as the producer of reality, knowledge. I'm not quite sure how to put it. You to quote your book, you say Foucault's dual concept of power knowledge showed the goals of power. So he's looking at the idea of science knowledge as an instrument of power dynamics, or is he looking at it entirely independently of that?
Well, he is looking, there's a difference between science and knowledge, and he's very careful about that.
Okay, that's a very good point. Maybe we should start with that. Can we start with that? Because I think that maybe this is a really important idea.
Yeah, so he starts, his interest was primarily in knowledge, yes? And by that we mean in French, savoir, like the kind of knowledge in general, you know. He's interested to sort of look at the, if you want, historiography, historicity of knowledge, you know. What is this thing called knowledge in relation to which the subject establishes itself? What is this thing that changes, and yet we always refer to it as an existing thing? And then, what is the condition of science? What is science in relation to knowledge? And when did science famously emerge? So knowledge is something that could be traced back to ancient Greece or to the kind of very roots of our civilization, to put it kind of simply, where sciences were constituted, particularly as such, in the late 18th and 19th century. And they were subject to a particular kind of method, and they were constituted within the kind of university settings, and they had this kind of notion that they have to be scientifically proved, they are based on evidence, they could be verifiable, and so on and so forth. So sciences are something that he sort of is very interested to sort of explore in all his work. And in a way, he sort of, in relation to sciences, always brings other things, phenomenological and, if you want, historical. So he always brings the three together, the phenomenological things like phenomena, like the madness, like the asylums, like the madmen, what do they do? Then he sort of relates it to the historical condition, to the emergence of the asylum in the first in the 17th and 18th century. First, in the 17th century, we have it in the form of general hospitals that emerged, but then the emergence of the asylum in the 18th century, he sort of traces it all very carefully, very, very kind of historically, etc., etc. So that's the historical aspect. And the third aspect is on the level of knowledge, if you want, epistemological aspect, on a level of history of science. What does this phenomena and this kind of historical condition means for knowledge of sciences? Yes, means for sciences. And this is where things come together, yes? Phenomena, historical moment, and epistemological moment, yes, kind of scientific moment. And this is the kind of Foucault's approach. This kind of intersection between the three is something that he would always address. So, yes, I have already mentioned something about savoir. Savoir, like the knowledge, is therefore something that could be traced back to Plato and Socrates, something that carries throughout the Middle Ages. It acquires a very particular form under Christianity. He's quite interested to explore Christianity as well. And we know that in his final years, he was actually working in a library of the friars in the center of Paris, because the National Library was just too busy and he just wanted to work in a small library. He was very much interested in this aspect of monastic knowledge, but that didn't sort of manage to be all that published. What he's well known is actually what happens from the 16th century onwards, yes? And this is where he sort of starts to investigate in details after having first established the conditions of madness and elaborated it in his PhD in the history of madness, yes, and elaborated the conditions of general hospitals and how different they were in the 17th century when they were first formed. I don't know if I should speak more about it, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah, go on.
And how then they changed in the 17th century under the influence of sciences, because 17th century general hospital were places where we have everybody, yes, not just as it were the mad, but also people who were just simply destitute, poor, who happened to have arrived in Paris in the 17th century second half, to be involved in the great, if you want, the rebirth of the city under the guidance of Louis XIV, of Louis XIV, where Paris was greatly rebuilt. So there was a need for a lot of work. There were some of this population was moved forcefully, some were kind of brought up, some were from various parts of the world. There was a kind of great movement of population, and some did better than the others. So there was also a lot of poor folk that couldn't quite kind of find its own way, and the streets were, as it were, full of these people, and you had somehow to make sense of it. So what was then kind of decided by the decree, if you want, is to start the General Hospital, Hôpital General, where you would just put all of these people from the street without sort of making much distinction who they were, whether they were mad, sick, poor, prostitutes or whatever. They were just all put there and sort of made to stay there. And that was the great confinement, what is usually known. And this is what Foucault speaks about greatly in his book. And this was a very strange moment. He actually tells us how this was a strange moment when we started to do that to people. And then he goes into analysis, why did it happen from the point of view of, kind of historical evidence for that. But then he also looks at the scientific evidence for that. So historical evidence for that he found in relation to the kind of movement of historical forces, the emergence of bourgeoisie, the need for the capitalistic relationships to kind of develop and sort of have somebody work for the capital. On the other hand, he links it also to some kind of new phenomena in sciences, new phenomena, if you want, even in architecture. That came, let's say, if we would make an architectural phenomenon, the phenomena would be to bring Claude Perrault into that, and his kind of argument for the new, which he did when he was at that time building the eastern facade of the Louvre. So, there was this kind of cross-section of the late 17th century would sort of give you a good picture of what it was. But what he is then interested to follow it up, in what happens to this same asylum, or same Hôpital General in the 18th century, he says something changes with the development of sciences under the Enlightenment, with the development of Linnaeus's work, biology, etc., classification of knowledge, biological species, etc., etc. We certainly have to have everything classified. So people that were in the hospital, General Hospital, also had to get classified. And they suddenly started to be kind of classified between the sick and the mad and the criminals. And from there, we start to emerge, we see emergence of the institutions such as the hospital for the ill, the clinic, the asylum for the mad, and the prison for the criminals. So those are the kind of three institutions that, in a way, started then to kind of take charge and sort of channel various unfortunate folks from these great hospitals.
I want to come back to this idea around the scientific knowledge, though, because I think that's really interesting. So you say in the book, the nature of professions, the language they create in order to further their society. So Foucault is looking at this power-knowledge dynamic and the way that professions, and I think this is where architecture is inflected quite heavily by Foucaultian analysis, or is helped by Foucaultian analysis, perhaps, and perhaps we haven't learned the half of what he's got to teach us yet, insofar as the profession remains resolutely incapable, apparently, of reflexively dealing with reality. But there's this idea within his discourses on institutional power and science, judging by how you've described it, the emergence of scientific kind of analysis or perceptions or interrogations of reality privilege, in a way, a certain kind of rationalist approach to the world, and it privileges therefore certain forms of knowledge. And it generates these new professions based around the specialization in judging by what you're saying again, for example, the specialization in care, from medical to asylum to prison kind of thing. But you go on also to talk about the way that then space becomes the way that he deals with ideas around space. So we've got this idea that language becomes an instrument of power dynamics. And that space is then inflected by this linguistic character. Is that making connections that don't necessarily appear in his work?
Just to sort of clarify this, he was not really interested into linguistics in the sense of structuralist and linguist. He famously said that he's not a structuralist.
Okay.
So he wants to go beyond that. And that's why he is much more interested in space. Yes. Mm-hmm. This is where, in a way, interest in space comes from, because he wants, as it were, to kind of he recognizes the limits of the language. I didn't mention that in his early work in the 50s, which is to some extent lesser known, but he sort of looks at the avant-garde writers and poets, and he's interested in the work of Blanchot, he's interested in the work of Raymond Roussel, he's interested in some other kind of less known and quite obscure avant-garde writers, including Bataille, and he sort of why they're interesting for him is because he sees that they expose the limits of the language. Yeah. And he sees that they are kind of pushing the language to the extent which they thought they could push it, and not far beyond that was any longer possible. Mm-hmm. So he was very much aware of this kind of knowledge and experience of these writers in the 50s. And that's why he thought that he has to go beyond that. That's why he was open to, if you want, both historical and archival research, and that's why he was open to the space and spatial research. Mm-hmm. So just to go back to the kind of categories of that you were asking me when I introduced the category of space in relation to the hospital general and in relation to three did emerge. Yes, it was he who famously recognized those categories. We nowadays teach them, and everybody's aware of them when they study architecture, of these categories as kind of a very normal thing. But in a way, it was not at all normal. Before Foucault, it was not, these kind of categories were not really studied very much. And they were, in a way, dug out, really, from obscurity by Foucault. By producing all these discourses. So in a way, he, by studying the discourse on mad, by studying the category of knowledge and its conditions and how it changes through time, and by recognizing the limits of language and the need to expand, if you want, into space, three-dimensional space, but also the space of history, he actually brought us, as architects, if I can put it that way, and architects interested in history and theory, to these categories of madness and asylum, prison, and the hospital. Yes, so this is kind of very interesting. If you want, this is kind of his contribution to architectural discourse, that he sort of brought these kind of categories from obscurity into kind of mainstream architectural history. And this was the trajectory was that. Not that he decided, I'm interested in architectural history. The trajectory was, I'm interested in the state of knowledge, and I'm interested how the state of knowledge develops, and I'm interested in the mad person, and I'm interested to know what else is being repressed about knowledge and related categories when we kind of repress this kind of knowledge about the mad. Mm. What he wants to make particularly strange is that, in a way, it was strange that we in the 17th century have put all these people behind the walls. Yeah. He was bringing the examples from the 16th century already, prior to all this development, where the mad people were living freely, usually at the edge of the cities, or in stultifera navis, famously the ship of fools, that were just sort of put to kind of glide in rivers, in various rivers across Europe, this country, or wherever. And you would have madmen usually in the ships traveling from port to port. And people would give them food, and they would come out, and they usually didn't bother many people. They would sometimes they would be used for fun. They would join some events, some holidays and some special events, religious events, or they would be involved in mask shows and these kind of things. But, there was a kind of place for them. They were not put behind the bar. They were not called insane. They were just called mad, and they had their life. That was at the time prior to the Enlightenment, yes, and prior to the Great Confinement, and in the time of Middle Ages as well, but throughout the 15th and 16th century. So we just have to imagine that life of plurality that was existing at the time, and where the place for the mad was just kind of another person in a society, almost like, that's who you are, and you just live your life, and that's it. And nobody's, you help them because you should help your fellow citizens.
So are you saying that sort of under Foucault's historical analysis, there's this turning point at the Enlightenment where there is a kind of turning against this strange and probably not insubstantial group of people, in this case the insane, and this is kind of this kind of reflects a broader shift in modern, because Enlightenment and the birth of modernity are probably fairly concurrent, if not exactly concurrent. Is Foucault's point that through the emergence of modern life or modernity as a paradigm, as a philosophical and economic paradigm, we see the kind of what we now call othering of certain groups that were otherwise not integrated into society, but were
part of society.
And is this what then inflects his way of thinking about the way that space operates and the way that space is produced in the modern realm as a mechanism for controlling and differentiating people?
Yeah, exactly. So that's why it was important that he brought space into that. You're right. He, in a way, differentiates slightly the 17th century, which has this kind of in-between condition. It's not yet fully Enlightenment, which in a way is properly established in the 18th century, and he describes it in detail. But it is not 16th century or the 15th century. It is this 17th century, which had so many things happening and so many contradictions, even in this country, but also in France and throughout Europe, which in a way was a century before the Enlightenment. And you have this kind of conditions which would fully be put into place, the change and the transformation of the society that sort of saw the rational paradigm as a dominant one. That transformation would happen only in the 18th century. But the 17th century was a kind of pre-Enlightenment period where all this happened. And this is why he has this category of Great Confinement, the Hôpital Général, as an institution that is typical for the 17th century, where everybody is just sort of rounded and confined, and not yet segregated in separate institutions, which are then much more rationalized. Yes, but they were confined here, and they were confined in chains, etc. So yes, there is this whole thing like that. Yes, and in the name of modernity and rationality, we have put our fellow citizen in confinement, and we have put them in chains. Is what he says. And we have designed this kind of institutions such as prisons and hospitals and etc., asylums, to actually serve that purpose. And we have done it in plain rationality, and we were kind of all part of that kind of world.
Yeah, and I mean, most people in architecture perhaps know about Foucault through his use of Jeremy Bentham's idea of the panopticon, this idea of a building, of an architecture which actively isolates and individuates and alienates. So to go back to Marx, alienates the prisoner in this particular case. But he uses this as a way of describing broader social relations within modernity, doesn't he?
Yes, he uses Bentham as an important example, and Bentham, there is a kind of synergy between Bentham and France, because Bentham famously went to France and has seen apparently the system that Louis XIV had in Versailles, where he had this famous structure which had a tower for him, the king, inside, and the menagerie, that is to say, all the animals from all around the world were put in separate segments radially, and he would just be in that tower in the middle and go around and observe his animals from menagerie. So some people say that that Bentham had the idea there, because this is a really kind of panopticon idea, and to some extent there is some truth in that. But anyhow, there is this kind of synergy, and Bentham, why Bentham did it for purely irrational, pragmatic reasons. He wanted to rationalize prison so that they would be less costly, so that we would have to employ less guard, yes, and sort of observe more people at the same time. And he also observed that it was enough not just to observe people, but to subjugate them to the experience that they think they are observed. And that's by that very thought, they would actually behave themselves. So that was the kind of genius of pragmatism of Bentham.
Yeah.
And of panopticon. So you don't have to really observe. You have to sort of make the other think that they are observed.
But there's this character to that idea that Foucault describes so well, that the scientific method is about the isolation of individual phenomenon at smaller and smaller scale, the discrete description of that, and the capacity to comprehend and fundamentally design things that can stop it. So pathogens and bacteria and radiation and so on and so forth. And there's that kind of idea within his discourse on Bentham's Panopticon, and perhaps also influenced by his living in Paris, which is designed like a panopticon. I know we like Paris, but Haussmann's plan is extremely alienating on purpose, I think, anyway. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
But perhaps there's this, so I'm kind of really interested in the way that this thing is done. But I wondered whether you could perhaps talk about that, but also talk about this word that you used earlier, this idea of fragility, which comes back in the way that I was hearing you to the relationship of this power dynamic and language, because language isn't that robust. Language isn't a big gun. Language is, it's just words, isn't it? It's just an expression. It's just noise, just air blowing over your larynx. It's kind of nothing. And yet, so I'm really interested in the way that language constitutes the framework through which power relations occur as a fragile thing, but then the way that that's embodied within architectural space. So the way that professionals embody those power dynamics of language within professional space. God, that's a lot. You don't have to touch all of that. That's a heavy-going question.
No, that's fine. I think you're getting there, but somehow what he also often he uses the term language when he talks about language very specifically. But I think he usually, in describing the situation in relation to power that you were just describing, he would use the word knowledge, because he sees that kind of synergy and the kind of the pairing of power and knowledge, something that works together. He does not say language and power work together. He would say knowledge, a particular kind of knowledge and power work together, because knowledge is usually established in relation to some kind of power, in a way, something to be chosen for us to study in schools, at university, and so on and so forth. It's not chosen by the strictest of epistemological analysis, what might be the most useful thing to know. It is always decided from the point of view of somebody who is in power and who decides what are we to study, yes? And what are we to teach our students, yes? So,
and that comes back to ideas of who we are as a society. So we teach a history, or we teach a chemistry, or we teach a biology based on what we want ourselves to be, or or more in his analysis, who the people in positions of authority want us to be.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So the same as, when we go for architectural education and how we go through it in relation to RIBA, ARB, and so on and so forth. These are this kind of institution that, in a way, if you want, dictate to us what are their learning outcomes. We have to teach our students. Yes. It's not that they ask us, what do you want to teach? That they've given it to us from the position of power. Yes. So in a way, there is no kind of discussion much for us there. We can choose it to do it one way or the other. But from the position of power, these institutions dictate what is going to be taught at the university or the School of Architecture.
Yeah.
So that is a kind of a position of power that institutions do have. That is how it looks in relation to architecture. Foucauldian analysis would then sort of see, so when did architecture establish itself as a profession? So you would then have to go into kind of seeking the origins of RIBA, who were the people who started it, who were the people who constituted it, what does it mean to be a registered architect, who is registered, who is not, and these kind of things. And you would then see by analyzing these kind of conditions and various stages that the relationships of power are always implicated. Yeah. And institutions as such are in a way having this enormous power. And why you are absolutely right to say that there is something much more kind of institutionally strong and obvious and transparent in Paris than in relation to London, I would agree with that. It's precisely for that they had both a very strong enlightenment, that they had a revolution in which they decapitated their king and thousands of people who belonged to the aristocracy. And that was done, yes, in the name of fraternity, equality, and
liberty.
Liberty for all.
Total liberty.
Yeah, first of all, liberty, yes. And then fraternity, and then equality. And you could see how that is at play now still, yes? Look at the demonstrations and all that we have in Paris. This is what they have. They have this right to rebel, much more than in this country. In this country, it would sort of have different kind of institutions who will have to deal with it. But in France, you have that. So in the 18th century, due to the revolutions, no matter that in the 19th century, we had a little bit of back and forth, in terms of republic exchanging itself to monarchy again and then going back to republic. Ultimately, republic prevailed, and ultimately enlightenment prevailed, and ultimately the institutions related to enlightenment prevailed, starting, of course, with the parliament and so on and so forth, but also in relation to kind of institutions such as College of Art, College of Architecture, Academy of Architecture, Academy of Art, various schools, Polytechnique of various technical scientists that became very important. All these kind of institutions actually have managed to establish themselves in the early 19th century, late 18th, sometimes early 19th century, very much in relation to this kind of political power that was available to them to claim due to the discourse, yes, based on knowledge of the Enlightenment. So savoir and the knowledge is kind of implicated with this kind of distribution of power. And this is kind of very obvious. And this is what you say, Osman is transparent? Yes, because in a way, although he was doing the works under Napoleon III, who originally commissioned him, but he was already part of that kind of discourse of transparency and overseeing kind of reason that in a way was no longer to hold back. The person who writes very beautifully about this transformation in France in relation to savoir and enlightenment and how rationality came to be in a way incorporated in architecture is Antoine Widler, and in particular in his book, Writing on the Walls, where he sort of goes and sort of looks at the particular authors, be it Catamer de Cancy or any others. I'm just sort of thinking of him at the moment. And he sort of looks at, let's say, typology that Catamer de Cancy introduces, and then he sort of makes a kind of a genealogy of this kind of concepts that typology he introduces and makes the parallel with the knowledge in biology. And or Serou d'Agincourt, who also made the kind of a taxonomy of buildings, which in a way have a direct parallel of taxonomy of plants and things like that. So Widler sort of exposes, Anthony Widler beautifully exposes all that in this book. And we see how that kind of discourse in a way prevailed, and how it incorporated itself into architecture, but in a way in all other forms of knowledge and practices.
So in architecture, of course, the way that we principally communicate is through drawing, through the production of buildings. And I think that's quite an interesting idea, that the language of architecture is primarily drawn, although of course we're talking about it, or perhaps that's probably contestable. But I'm not gonna. But perhaps we shouldn't get stuck in that contestation there. But you to quote from your book, when talking about the ideas of space and the application of Foucaultian thinking to space, you say the manner of representation, its spacing and its framing of the object have direct effects upon any possible knowledge about the object. In this context, both architecture and its drawings, its models, and its other spatial experiential instances all have an impact upon concepts, knowledge, and practice. Because Foucault excavates and observes the aspect of this spatiality and their effects on knowledge, manages to unearth and disclose the spaces into which objects, statements, and knowledge were set and spatialized and positioned in order to become concepts. And I think there's something really interesting in this idea that the way that architectural language produces or preferences, foregrounds certain cultural norms and values, and that, going back to, say, for example, your discussions around the hospital or your discussions around the panopticon, we've got this idea of architecture acting as an instrument of institutional power, of institutional knowledge, but also adding to it its own thing. And I thought I was struck by this when you were talking about this idea of architectural education. If you go into the RIBA ARB criteria on education, they're actually quite vague. And then there's so you've got this kind of idea of a top layer of institutional knowledge, but below that is how people then apply it. And I find that fascinating too, that it's not just power and powerless, but there are these grades within this kind of discourse-based knowledge. There are grades of power within that. So I, as a tutor, interpret the RIBA ARB criteria, and I produce module briefs and specifications, which then impose upon the students, who then interpret it in relation to their own self. And then the third year students, who are a bit smarter than the first year students, then they kind of impose through cultural force. So I'm kind of interested in the way that works, but I'm really interested in the way that Foucaultian thinking has been used to interrogate and analyze the production of architectural knowledge through drawing and through its writing as well.
Yes, well, absolutely, you're right. On the point of view of drawing, that's absolutely right. But what is interesting here is that architectural drawings didn't emerge in the 17th or 18th century. They emerged at the beginning of the 16th century. So there is a kind of, like, one would have to go a bit back to kind of establish them. But what is interesting, and that is also quite important, and that appears in Robin Evans's book on the projective cast. There's also a difference to architecture drawings, which happens in the later 16th century, because we have a proliferation of printing press. So although we had architecture drawings, let's say, at the end of the 15th century and beginning of the 16th century, before we had the full proliferation of the architectural drawings through architectural treatises, yes, in a way that was that sort of the fact that we had drawings before was not so relevant. For example, it's true that Alberti's, their Edificatoria, when you look at it nowadays, it has illustrations, yes? Whether you look at it, which edition do you look, it has illustrations. But in a way, when it emerged in the 15th century, it was just a manuscript. It emerged before it was publishable, printable. So in a way, it was just a manuscript. So that was one kind of life. Then when it became, when we acquired the printing press, then it sort of acquired a different kind of life. You could print it, but then it finally acquired a third kind of life when you had the kind of illustration that you could attach to the printing of the text, and that sort of started to circulate in another way. And that was when Cosimo de Bartoli in the 16th century put the drawings first, and he put the woodcuts. But then that was not sophisticated enough in the 18th century, which is where Leone put kind of new kind of more sophisticated drawings, which were actually etchings. So in a way, what is kind of interesting here is to kind of, observe that there was something that needed to be said about this particular architectural treatise or architectural knowledge presented in this treatise, that in a way always had to be improved and sort of made more explicit, clearer, more articulated, and so on and so forth, by as the centuries went on, and as our technology, in a way, of knowledge and knowledge dissemination improved. So in a way, the technology of knowledge dissemination is a crucial word here. And in the way, in the 18th century, this is something that was really picking up. Yes, and that was why it was very famous that encyclopedists have, and Diderot, Denis Diderot, and the others have published all these kind of books, which were encyclopedic knowledge, which had a pieces of writing and a piece of imagery attached to it, through which the knowledge could be disseminated universally in a form which could be kind of fixed. Yes. Yeah. So that's a kind of in relation to drawings, and architecture's discourse was therefore kind of part of that kind of disseminational economy, part of that kind of economy of dissemination of both images and treatises and et cetera, et cetera. One could also introduce, in addition to that, the whole question of cartography and plans and so on and so forth on an urban level, which is also important, that happens in parallel. But it is particularly relevant in Paris in the 19th century. Widler speaks about it in the other book when he addresses the history of Paris and urban design in Paris. But what is important in what you were saying is, in relation to freedom and in relation to kind of the local possibility for you and other tutors or teachers to kind of impose a little bit of autonomy, which is in a way provided by a little bit of power that we have as tutors and teachers. Yes, it's absolutely right. This is what Foucault would say. We as tutors, we have power within this kind of larger power structure that is given to the universities, because universities are also given power, first of all, to be the places where the knowledge could be distributed, and they are these kind of institutions. Yes, so this is all part of power relations, and power is not a thing. That's crucial to kind of say here. Power is a relation. Yes, it's a relation between the individual or two individual or individuals and institution or different institutions, but it's a kind of relation, and the purpose of that relation is that in a way one can impose oneself upon the other for the purposes of government, for the purposes of running something, government in a kind of wider sense, of governing the university, of governing the program, of governing the society as well. So all relationships within the society are in a way dependent on the relations of power. And it's just a question of how that kind of distribution of power is being organized, and what kind of knowledge or knowledges are being used in the negotiation and distribution of power.
I see.
So,
Yeah, I get
is-
that. So there's this idea that I am fascinated by, which is this idea of gatekeepers or whatever it is, thresholds between knowledge, and who is allowed to cross thresholds to knowledge and therefore gain levels of credibility. And what I find interesting about the issue around tutors is the way that architectural education across the board. I'm reading a really interesting book at the moment by Susanna Hagen. I'm recording a podcast with Susanna Hagen called Revolution, Architecture in the Anthropocene. And she talks about the way that architectural education it almost seems like it's impossible for a genuinely environmental architecture to emerge, given not actually the RIBA's criteria or the ARB's criteria, but given the social structuring of knowledge power at the level, sort of at an intuitive or subconscious level. I find that very fascinating. Like, why do we all, across the board, kind of drive this capitalist vernacular kind of object-orientated ontology, whatever you call it, in architecture? Like what like no one seems to want to break out, and even those that do don't seem to be able to. So I'm really fascinated by the way that Foucaultian idea of power might reflect on that. And I guess where I want to get to, where I want to get to is kind of better understanding what Foucault kind of perhaps helps us reflect on as architects who have a very, very refined knowledge base, but perhaps if we are to generate a more meaningful, more just, more egalitarian, more fraternal, more free architecture, then more sustainable architecture, what we actually need to do is recognize in our own practices where we build those thresholds, where we build those boundaries, be it in our drawings, in our specifications of work, in the way that we talk, and look at how we can perhaps unpack those things so that we become a more responsive and dynamic and useful, actually business-wise, more useful kind of discipline.
You're absolutely right. It's a kind of a central question. How can Foucault help us in that? Foucault would sort of, my inclination is that Foucault would see architects as very much sort of not evolved politically, yes, as architects sort of happy to kind of speak to each other. We are often happy to speak to each other. We are often, and then also perhaps the proponents of power are also happy to let us speak to each other, as long as they can kind of do the kind of main distribution of power and do major decision making. So to some extent, we are kind of solipsistically sometimes talking too much to ourselves and not talking enough either to those who are in power, or listening enough to those who are the participants, the users, the everyday person. So we are kind of a bit isolated from both. If you want, we are a bit isolated from those in power, and we are a bit also keeping our position kind of quite often separate from the ordinary folks, so to speak. So we are not really socially active enough, and we don't reflect a lot on that. We are also seduced by this very love for drawings, which we almost value too much, because drawings are in a way not so important for architecture. They're not. You can now almost do without drawings. There was architecture before drawings. Drawings is just a Renaissance invention. In other cultures, architecture drawings don't exist to the same extent. But we fell in love with the drawings more than with architecture. In some occasions, we fell in love with beauties of paintings, of imagery, and so on and so forth. So that kind of seduction from 16th century onwards is still kind of dominating architecture, this kind of seduction and this kind of canonical attitude towards beauty and aesthetic representation of architectural objects. We are still mesmerized by that. We still love our kind of drawings. We still love to see pretty drawings somewhere else. And that, in a way, is totally unnecessary. You know, when you think of the larger picture of global architecture from, you know, millennia ago. Yes, they're just one episode that's sort of carried in within Western architecture from 16th century onwards. So yes, it's unnecessary, but we don't see that very kind of solipsistic love for the beauty of drawings and for the beauty of architecture that we think is in drawings. That also makes us isolated from the society overall, for those whom we build for, like a general users for whom we built and who are in a way not in a position of power, but who should be listened to. And also we are kind of not quite reaching those in power because they kind of let us do whatever we want because they will decide at the end.
Yeah. I mean, what does Foucault suggest? I mean, but as we started at the beginning, there's this highly activist-like quality about not only his methodology, which is dynamic, it's like action research in a way. It's like a kind of peculiar hybrid, very, very interesting, very exciting, I think, for researchers. But he is also he's almost also an activist, a political activist, particularly in relation to his own identity and so on and so forth. Which I think is very interesting. I mean, what does he suggest through his writing? Is there a kind of description of reality and then a kind of positioning for action, or does he leave it hanging and sort of, I guess, step back and see what unfolds? Because he doesn't strike me as being a dispassionate observer. He's not the scientist, although he is very rigorous.
Yeah, towards the end of the book, when I talk about spatiality and when I talk about kind of try to tease architectural kind of points, you know, from Foucault, you know, I'm sort of trying to address that. He specifically wouldn't address architects or what architects should do. Yes, he was never kind of doing that. The architects usually like to refer to his writing on heterotopia because it kind of gives them something spatial to chew about and think about. And then he thinks, oh, Foucault's thinking about space in architecture is all about heterotopia. And that's nonsense. You know, it just that the name sounds good and people like, again, this concept that you have some isolated place where rules are different than anywhere else. And people who are in a kind of fragile state of mind can go there and live lives differently, like in some kind of heterotopia, like, you know, and this is this fragility that we as architects also have, and we somehow like to live in our own heterotopias in a sense that we kind of talk to each other too much and not enough to other people. So yes, there is a problem with that, but at the same time, heterotopias are sometimes necessary. Foucault answers, in particular for individuals who are in crisis, he says. So they're like this kind of monastic elements, or they're like the schools or something like that. So that was one way of teasing what Foucault sort of comes to think about architecture and spaces. The other thing what he does is, you could see that he would generally interrogate, you know, the experience of spaces, like what do spaces do? That would be Foucauldian approach. What do particular spaces do to a subject? Yes. How they affect the subject? What are the spatial effects of this particular building or that particular building upon people who live there, work there, enter there, come in and out of there? What are the effects of that? So those would be kind of Foucauldian question. And he believes that indeed all architecture was built with that in mind. It was certainly built from the 18th century onwards, but even before, you know, it was to produce particular kind of effects. And from 18th century onwards, this was perhaps more rationally articulated, but it was always architecture was always about producing effects. But so he would go into that. It is quite interesting what is his relationship to Deleuze as well, because as you might know, when he got back to Paris after his doctorate and all that, and the period of staying in Tunisia and so on and so forth, he was given to study university at the Department of Philosophy in Vincennes University in Vincennes, and that's where he employed and give job, give academic position to some famous people, now famous people, who were at the time young philosophers such as Deleuze. He immediately saw in Deleuze somebody who was thinking kind of outside the block, who was thinking with a power which was in a way much more dynamic, which was kind of not constrained to the kind of walls of academia or walls of enlightenment or writing on the walls of enlightenment, who was not restricted within the same categories, perhaps not even within the categories that he was. And to some extent, he admired that in Deleuze. He liked this kind of savage thinking that in a way Deleuze had, which he sort of said that it was gutsy and that it was sort of allowing for new kind of spaces to be kind of envisaged and unfolding and emerging and so on and so forth. So this is quite important in that sense. It appears in his writing on in this essay in this book, which is called Language Counter-Memory Practice, where in a way you have this kind of selected essays that Foucault talks about. I'm just trying to sort of see which one is that. Yes, it's the one which is called Theatrum Philosophicum, where he sort of mentions a lot of philosophers and sort of puts them in relation to some kind of spatial context where he sees them. So he mentions also, who would in that theater or in this play whom, and he brings the characters that are important for him, and he brings the characters such as Deleuze, but he also brings Plato and the classics and Diogenes Laertius. He brings in a constant discussion, we have Deleuze and Platonism. So that's kind of interesting. It's a kind of a fantasy, this kind of theater. But what is interesting that it has a very strong spatial component, and in a way, in that sense, it is great. It also has a literary component because he also brings writers. He brings also actors. He brings people who would be considered avant-garde at the time, and he wants to kind of give them roles. So there is this kind of avant-garde component to his writing, which includes space, which includes unfolding of a new space, which is definitely not classical. So this space is the space of interruption, of movement, of dynamics, of unfold, of phantoms. Yes, it appears in this kind of text. Yes, it appears also in his discourse on death and the labyrinth, which in a way was his early discourse, but let's not go into that now.
I mean, it's so rich as a topic. There's so much there, and I think it's going to take a lot of unpacking for us to get our heads around it. But I did wonder whether we could finish on a little bit about perhaps tying in this idea of the material kind of focus of Foucault, this idea of the materiality, so the kind of phenomenological ideas that you see in Merleau-Ponty, but also this idea that reality is constructed through the interaction of people and stuff, their environments, materials, their social relations. And I suppose what pops out at the end of it is Bruno Latour then adding in technology into this kind of mix. So you can kind of see this in these three thinkers. There's this kind of, in a way, an evolution of an idea of the nature of knowledge and how we perceive in the world, which kind of gets shifted and complexified in various ways between the three of them. And I was wondering whether you could just quickly, maybe you had some kind of thoughts around that.
Yes, yes, perhaps I could say something about that. Yes, it is important that Foucault emerges within this context, which in a way was already kind of provided with some kind of attitude which enabled him to turn his philosophizing towards the concrete reality,
Yeah.
which is this kind of world of phenomenology. So it is really a great thing that we had philosophers, French philosophers such as Blanchot, Bachelard, Merleau-Ponty, Bergson, and all of them who have written these great pieces about everyday phenomena, and who have provided us with the knowledge that this is fine to be a philosopher and talk about that rather than the sort of usual themes from the history of philosophy or kind of arguments directly from the critique of Kant or Hegel. So, this was a great phenomena into which he entered. So this kind of living for concrete is something that he wanted to espouse. But what he also brings, and this is what is important, is he brings it this kind of rigor where he said, I'm not going just to kind of take that and just sort of mention it. I'm actually going to dig out for the deeper knowledge of the history of that phenomena, whatever that might be that I'm investigating, because one has to know the deeper historical knowledge and read the traces that still permeate phenomena in the present that make us as we are. So we have to know, as it were, the genealogy of the phenomena that makes us, through which we live, through which we exist, through which we speak, through which we become subjects, yes? We have to know the conditions of our emergence as subjects, which might also involve some kind of techniques through which subject is made. We didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about his discourse on sexuality, or history of sexuality, because this is something that comes towards the end of his career, once the kind of discourse on asylum, discourse on clinique, and discourse on prison has emerged. He actually looks at the history of sexuality, which in a way, the first book is famously called Volonté de savoir, which means will to know. Yes, so he links the kind of history of sexuality to the techniques of making a subject, yes, through the techniques imposed upon the subject throughout the process of his or her education, which is perceived as repression, but is, in fact, a wider kind of form of technique and guidance about the nature of the subject the society wishes to produce. So he goes into that, first of all, in the volume 1 of History of Sexuality, which he looks at the kind of 19th century and whole kind of discourse, and exposes in a way the duplicity of this meaning of the repression of sexuality that allegedly we were all believe, as it were, existed, by saying that in a way we all think that there is this thing as repression of sexuality, but perhaps this is just one of the techniques through which we are to be guided. How are we to behave? In one word, this is what he is trying to say. In the Sexuality number 2, volume number 2, he looks at the kind of Greeks, and the kind of goes back to the pre-BC times, 4th and 5th century Greece, and he sort of looks at the ways in which young boys were made to develop, and what were the conditions on which under which they were to develop, and what their relationship to truth, so-called parhasia, was supposed to be. So there is this kind of techniques upon which, and in relation to which, young men were raised in order to make them kind of proper citizens of Athens, for example. And then he sort of follows that up through Middle Ages and how that relates to the rituals of confession in the Middle Ages in Christianity and so on and so forth, and how that ritual of confession could be sort of brought all the way to psychoanalysis. And he sort of analyzes this thing of what does it mean to confess? What does it mean to know to have the knowledge of oneself, of one's state of mind, of one's state of unconscious and conscious desires, etc., etc. So that is something that he also carries on in his History of Sexuality, number 3, which in a way kind of remains unfinished as he was sort of becoming ill and was not fully kind of able to finish it as he would have liked it. What these things are, why I mention them, is because they are usually refers to something in Foucault's discourse, which is called technology of the self, which is this about, it is not a technology in a Heideggerian sense, like something that pertains to techne and something to which, in a way, the subject is to relate. But unfortunately, we have lost, according to Heidegger, this kind of relationship to techne in the course of our history, and that's why we are now lost in relation to the so-called being. Yes, that's in short. So what Foucault is doing, he is not taking that approach of Heideggerian approach towards technology and kind of being. He is sort of looking at technology as something that happens to the subject and not something that pertains to the being and subject relations to the being. He looks at technology as something that happens to the technology of the self. What is that? What are these conditions that have made us as we are? So, yes, you could see how that is a kind of another important part of his work in relation to the others that have emerged in an earlier part of his career. This, in a way, was very difficult for him, and he has done a lot of backwards and forwards, a lot of rewriting, and a lot of not publishing, and a lot of changing. And he was never quite sure where he wanted to go. And in a way, it remained very much to his interpreters afterwards and partners like Danielle Defer and the others who have given autobiographies and were trying to give some kind of a lightening version on that. But that sort of remains largely still a mystery, and in a way, a lot of studies are still to open in that respect.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm really grateful, Gordana, for your joining me on this.
Yes, it was a great pleasure. I hope this was good, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
As the man himself said, people know what they do. Frequently they know why they do what they do, but what they don't know is what they do does. Well, I think we do. Thank you to Gordana for making it clear and for taking the time to participate in this podcast. Thanks to Routledge for the book. Please see the podcast descriptions for links to it, where you can buy it, of course, and to Gordana's social professional profiles. Gordana is presenting this work in the Thinkers for Architecture Dialogue 1 Symposium at Manchester's School of Architecture with the Manchester Architecture Research Group later this month, which is linked in the podcast description too. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and share this episode far and wide. And thanks for listening. Cheers.